Good morning or good afternoon, as the case may be. Hey guys, welcome to week 2 of the quarantine. This week we're going to go ahead and explore the evidence of evolution. Today we're going to talk about it. Tomorrow we'll have a lab day, or rather Wednesday you'll have a lab day, and then Friday you guys are going to take a look at neutral versus natural evolution and some stuff with that. So it'd be pretty cool. We're almost to the end of the evolution unit. Whew, wow, it's taken us not very long to get here, but it'll be really exciting to take a look at some of this stuff and really see how all these big ideas we've been talking about are actually applicable to the real world. So let's go ahead and dive in. So the first thing about evolution is a lot of people say, well, evolution is just a theory, or it's just an idea. It's like, I have a theory about why I like potato chips, or I have a theory about how aliens were secretly behind the construction of the pyramids in Egypt. Because, of course, people back then couldn't figure out how to build stuff. Yeah. Anyway, what do we mean when we say a theory in evolution? And why does it mean something different than the theory that we use in everyday language? Okay. In science, when we use the word theory, it's not like when we use the word theory in everyday. Word theory in everyday is like, it's a hunch, it's an idea. It might be completely unfounded. We have no idea, right? But in science, such as physics or mathematics or chemistry or biology, when we use the word theory, we're saying this is an idea that has been tested numerous times, thousands upon thousands of times. The evidence supports it. All the hypotheses have been supported, right? And it's a very well-tested idea. When we use the word theory in science, you can replace it with the word fact. Evolution is a fact. We know it happens. We might still have some questions as to why it happens or how it happens, right? But those questions are not something that we can answer right now. But we know that it does happen. We know that evolution is the way that life is unified and diversified. It's been shown so many times. The great thing about a theory in science is not only is it well tested, but it also helps us to bring together a bunch of ideas and explain them together. So it's a really nice synthesis of a bunch of things. And most importantly, it allows us to make accurate predictions. And that's the awesome thing about evolution, is that it allows us to make accurate predictions as to what should happen, such as on the on the Galapagos, right? So when we had the drought come along and only the big cactus seeds were left, we would assume that only birds with large beaks would survive to reproduce and pass on that trait, and therefore the birds would become more large-beaked on a whole, and that is what we saw. So it allows us to make really cool predictions about new situations and about old ones. We also are able to make predictions sort of going back into the past and saying what sort of fossils and stuff should we find if evolution were to be true, and we found those fossils. So it's pretty cool. So what's the theory and a law? A law, like the law of gravity or the laws of thermodynamics, if you take physics or chemistry, those laws are basically theories that have been proven so many times and with such degrees of accuracy that at this point, we pretty much consider them beyond fact. They're just like the things that run the universe. They're sort of just assumed to be true. Now, we do keep an open mind about them, however, because there's still some things about gravity that we don't understand. But for the most part, they're tried and true, and we know them. So, why is an evolution a law? We still have some questions about the mechanisms that allow evolution to occur. So, what is more important, natural selection or neutral evolution, which we'll learn about? Those are the kinds of questions that make evolution still a theory. But again, it's not just a theory. It is well proven, it's well tested. We just have to figure out a few more things about it. So that's just the first thing I wanted to clear up, is that evolution, when we say theory, means fact. So what evidence or data actually supports Darwin's ideas on evolution? So the first bit of evidence is the fossil record. Right, and then, so we'll talk about this a little bit, but fossils are the remains of organisms or the imprints of organisms from long times ago. Fossils show us anatomical or physical changes in organisms over time. And if you were to really imagine what you would really want to see in fossils, you would imagine that, okay, if we wanted evidence that evolution was really happening, we should be able to see an unbroken line of organisms from the very first organism all the way up to the new ones and see how those small physical changes based on changes in their DNA led to large changes and eventually led to speciation, stuff like that. So we should have that record, and we do have a very good record. It's incomplete, and we'll talk about the reason why, but that's what the fossil record offers us, is this visual, physical manifestation of evolution over time. Biogeography talks about the patterns of evolution we can see across landscapes. So we can see that all the continents kind of fit together like puzzle pieces, and we can trace the mountains and see how the mountains in one continent line up with the mountains of another. And the organisms that live on the mountains on one continent and the mountains on the other continent kind of line up with it are very similar to each other, but their physical features change based off of changes in their environment. So it's really cool to be able to kind of look across geography and be like, hey, yeah, actually animals are different based off of where they live. And so we can see that natural selection at work, and closely related organisms look fairly similar and are usually geographically very close to each other. And if they're not, they're on those little borders that we can see between continents to show that once upon a time they were very close to each other. They were the same population. They were split up by allopatric speciation. So it's pretty cool. Comparative anatomy is going to look at the body structures of both living and extinct organisms and compare their bone structures, their musculature, all that sort of the physical stuff that you can see, and see whether or not they can suggest relationships. Vestigial organs are going to be organs in your body that are kind of left over from previous evolutionary times. They're still hanging around because natural selection hasn't got rid of them, but they're no longer really useful, such as your wisdom teeth or your appendix. We'll talk a little bit about those. Comparative embryology, which is to show comparisons between embryos of different organisms and to see how, wow, actually all organisms develop in exactly the same way, which suggests that they all had a single common ancestor, that they were all once one organism and they diversified. And so that's going to be really cool to look at. And then there's molecular biology, which is looking at the DNA and different molecules of organisms and seeing how closely their DNA is related to each other. So let's dive in. Like I said, fossils are preserved remnants of ancient organisms. They're usually the imprint or, the remnants, the calcified or rock replaced bone structures of organisms that can be found in soft rocks like sedimentary or, in impressionable rock surfaces. The fossil record is really cool because we can look at it and see, yeah, actually we can go all the way back and see, okay, there was this one lineage of organisms and they had slight changes in their physical features, like you guys can see in the picture at the bottom. And those slight changes in physical features represented different species that were along their evolutionary lineage and led to what we have today, which is really cool to be able to see, the size and shape of the skull, the size and shape of ridges and different things to support different physical features, it's really cool. Now, a lot of people say, oh, we don't have the fossil record. We don't have the record to actually show that evolution has happened, and that's super false. We have thousands upon thousands of fossils to show the record. Is it a complete record? No. And the reason why is that these fossils are in the ground. And think about anything you learn about from earth science. Our ground is constantly shifting. It is floating on a literal ball of magma. Your ground, the ground that we walk on every day, is constantly being replaced. It is broken by faults. There are earthquakes. There are floods. Stuff destroys it all the time. So no, we're not going to have a complete record of fossils because a lot of them are being destroyed as we speak. People will say, oh, that's convenient. No, it's not. Any evolutionary biologist would give their eye teeth to be able to have a complete fossil record. It is so frustrating to have all of this evidence and to be able to find only bits and pieces of it. But those bits and pieces, even so, have shown us this incredible lineage, and we are able to trace the evolutionary lineages of organisms over time using the fossil record. Now, one thing to note is that this is all anatomical. It's all physical features, because obviously we can't extract a lot of molecular data from these organisms. Those molecules died out a long time ago. So it's really just physical features that we can look at in the fossil record. Okay, how do we actually use fossils to determine how old these organisms are? So as you might imagine, showing the age of an organism is really helpful to see whether, oh, did this happen, was this organism the ancestor of this one because it lived a lot longer ago, or is it a descendant of that one because it came about more recently? So we can tell the dating of fossils using two methods. The first one is relative dating. No, this does not mean dating your cousin or sister. It means using the relative position of the fossil in the ground relative to other fossils to tell the age. So this is also called the law of superposition, and the idea is that fossils that are older are going to be farther down in the ground, where that fossils that are younger are going to be farther up in the ground. And this makes sense, right? Because based off Earth science again, you have the constant renewing of Earth is, Earth is constantly being laid on top of old Earth. If you guys learned about that in the trenches way down in the bottom of the ocean floor that are constantly spewing up new ground and new rock and new dirt, And so all that stuff is constantly piling on top of the old dirt, and it takes a long time, but eventually that means that fossils get shifted down and down and down and down, and so older fossils can be found below. Now this isn't always the case. Sometimes younger fossils can be found further down, and the reason for that is the type of rock. Some rock layers are deposited more quickly than others, and also because of natural disasters, sometimes fossils can get all scrambled up underground. So that's some of the reason why that can occur. The other thing that we use is radioactive dating or absolute dating. And so if you guys remember back when we learned about atoms, we learned about isotopes. An isotope is a different version of an atom, of an element. It has a different number of neutrons, and the different number of neutrons makes it more unstable. So isotopes can be radioactive, and they start emitting energy. And that energy we call radiation, right? So you guys should know what that is. Radiation, as it's radiated from a radioactive isotope, can actually tell us how old that atom is, and if that atom is a part of a fossil, then it can tell us how old that fossil is. So if the atom is radiating energy and we look at its mass and we can be like, wow, okay, so this is how much mass it has left, this is how much mass it would originally have started with, okay, so this is how long it takes it to emit that energy, we know how old it is. And the cool thing is that the energy is emitted at a constant rate. It never changes, that rate of emission. So we can always tell based off of constants how old it is. So we use half-lives to calculate this, which is the length of time required for half of the atoms in the sample to decay. And we actually know, based on chemistry, all the half-lives for the elements. So it's really easy for us to pick up an element, take a look at it, determine its half-life, see its mass, and then determine how old a fossil is. It's pretty cool. I'm going to go back one if I can. Okay, biogeography. So biogeography is, again, showing the distribution of organisms across landscapes that show evolutionary relationships. So it's really cool. It can kind of show us visually how organisms change based off that allopatric and sympatric speciation we learned about. So closely related but different organisms are usually different because of different environments. So they might be closely related because they were once the same population, but let's say they're split on either side of a mountain. One side of the mountain is cold, one is hot. They start to adapt to those different conditions, and they might end up looking or living slightly differently based off those conditions, even though they're very closely related. An example of this is tortoises on the Galapagos. So those turtles on the Galapagos, they're closely related because they're all out there on this small little cluster of islands. But because they live on different islands and there's not gene flow, they've changed their appearance to adapt to the different environments on each of those islands. And then distantly related but similar species, so species that seem like they should be related but they're not, are usually based off of similar environments. So we can see the jaguar and the leopard over there on the right. They look very similar. You would think, of course they're related. They got to be super closely related, but they actually aren't. They're not evolutionarily very closely related at all, and the reason they look similar is because they have similar environments that require a similar type of camouflage, a similar ability to hear and smell and to see. So that's those features that they've developed allow them to do that very well. And you can also, another great example of this is dolphins and sharks, right? Dolphins and sharks, they look very similar. If you were to see the dorsal fin come out of the water, I mean, I would just freak out anyway. I'd be like, I don't care what it is, I'm getting away from it, but it could be a dolphin or a shark. But when you actually look at their bone structure and their DNA and their other physical features, dolphins are mammals, sharks are fish. They're very, very evolutionarily distant, but they evolved similar features to adapt to similar environments and similar pressures. Okay, so then we have comparative anatomy. So comparative anatomy is comparing the physical body features of organisms, whether they're living or extinct, to determine their evolutionary relationships. And usually there are very unique types of bone structures that are within organisms that can sort of tip us off that they're evolutionarily closely related. Anatomy is just physical body structures, though, so we can't actually use this to compare molecular data like DNA. This is just the physical features. However, it is useful. There's three main structures we're going to talk about here. The first is homologous structures. So homologous structures have different functions. So you can see the human arm is going to be for grabbing, the cat's paw is going to be for walking, the whale's flipper is going to be for swimming, and the bat's wing is going to be for flying. But the bone structures of all of them are actually the same. So interestingly enough, those are all the same types of bones. They've just been modified for length, curvature, and width to fulfill different functions. So we can see the human bones have fulfilled the length and width requirements for being able to reach and to grab with opposable thumbs and dexterous fingers. The cat's bones have been modified so that you can see that very light bone there in the middle next to the gold bone. That's been thickened to allow for better impact absorption. The curvature is also allowing for better impact absorption and speed. And then the close bones of the foot are again for impact absorption, but also support for walking on all fours and also being able to attack. Whales, we can see that the bones have been thickened at the base to be able to provide resistance to the incredible water pressure that they have to face when they are swimming. And the bones in the hand have been elongated to be able to support a long, flat fin. And then we can see the bones in the bat have been made thinner and also more hollow, lighter, so that they can fly. And then the finger bones, of course, have been elongated to support the skin of the wing. So even though they're the same exact bones, they've been modified evolutionarily to be able to perform different functions. And that's really what we can say gives them common ancestry. All of these are mammals, right? And so if we compare all of these mammals together, we can see, wow, okay, their bone structures are very similar. This suggests they had a common ancestor at one time with all of those bones, and that common ancestor split off a long, long time ago and became many other populations that evolved into many other organisms with different modifications on that same bone structure. So homology does show evidence for ancestry. Analogous structures do not show common ancestry, or at least not recent common ancestry. They show that organisms are very differently related evolutionarily to each other, even though they have similar functions. So unlike homologous structures that all had different functions but the same bones, these might have similar structures. They do similar things, right? They fly, but they have different internal structures and they're not closely evolutionarily related. So we can see here this great example in birds, bats, and pterodactyl and moth wings. So the moth wing has absolutely no bones, but it's used for flight. It's not at all closely related to a structure that is used for flight in the pterodactyl wing, but we can see the pterodactyl wing has a lot of bones that the other ones doesn't. Even though it might share similar coloration, it shares very different bone structure. So the pterodactyl is not closely evolutionarily related to the bird, and the bird is not closely evolutionarily related to the bat. Even though all these structures fly, some use skin, some use feathers, some have bones that are for claws, some do not. Some have two bones where there's only one in another organism, and then the moth has no bones at all. So this is due to that convergent evolution, that biogeographical convergent evolution, where we see organisms facing similar environmental pressures and evolving similar features to try to deal with those pressures. It, again, does not suggest recent common ancestry. Homologous structures suggest that. We finally have vestigial organs, and these were once used for a different thing in your body, or in not necessarily in your body, but in your ancestor's body a long, long time ago. And so in humans, we can see that the wisdom teeth were once because we had a larger jaw, and that larger jaw was for, being able to bite down on bones and meat and snapping them open and being able to get the nutrients. We don't do that so much anymore, and in fact, the jaw muscles and the jaw themselves were reduced in size so that we could have more space to have more prefrontal cortex in our brain so that we could think more. So our jaws were actually reduced so that we would have better brain power, which is pretty cool to think about. But we still have those wisdom teeth, those darn wisdom teeth. Why? When we don't have the jaw to fit them anymore? Well, because remember, natural selection doesn't get rid of things that are uncomfortable. It gets rid of things that stop you from reproducing. And so your wisdom teeth might be uncomfortable, they might be painful, eventually they might kill you if you had an infection or something, but usually they don't kill people before they reproduce, and so the genes that code for them are passed on and on and on. The only way to not have vestigial organs like teeth would be for us to only mate with somebody else who didn't have them if we didn't have them, and obviously that comes with a lot of moral and ethical problems. So vestigial structures are there to hang around. Vestigial structures in whales, a great example is the pelvic bone in whales. Whales don't need pelvises because they don't have legs, but it suggests that a long time ago an ancestor of the whale, not whales themselves, but some other species that whales evolved from, had legs, and that the whales still have them. They're not getting rid of them because they're not stopping them from reproducing, but they still have these little vestigial reduced pelvises, which are pretty interesting. Vestigial structures can still serve some function in your body, but they're not serving their original one. They might be reduced in size, but they do show that there has been evidence of evolution or change over time, because it does show that ancestrally humans had larger jaws and that whales came from organisms that had legs. So it's a transition from land to water. It's pretty cool. And then comparative embryology. So when we talk about embryology, we're talking about the development of organisms from conception and that little ball of developing cells, the zygote, all the way up through development into the actual organism itself. Embryology is amazing because we can look across different species and see that they all start by looking at like the one on the left, and then they differentiate to look like various forms of the thing on the right. What's awesome though is that they follow the same boot up pattern and the boot up code. So the same, I want you to think of it like a computer code. The same processes happen. It's like, you know, when you cut on your computer, you might have like a Windows 95 or 97 at home, some old computer, or you might interact with an older computer, and then you have a newer computer, you might cut that both of them on. Both of them are going to start with a similar boot up process. You're going to see the little Windows icon flash on the screen and all that sort of stuff. And it's going to look pretty much identical until you get to the actual, you know, the screen that comes after that, which is for Windows 10 is going to look really cool and sleek, and for Windows 95 is going to be like, oh my God, it's going to look really old. And so the same thing we can actually see happening in embryology. So at the very top is a bunch of different species of organisms. The first row there at the very top is showing their original embryonic forms. And you can see there's really not much difference between any of these embryos. They're following the same boot up code. And then as we go down into 2, we start to notice some appreciable differences, right, between them as that boot up code starts to show changes. And then finally, that boot up code shows a lot of changes on the last row. We can see the difference between the human over here versus the rabbit versus the calf versus the pig versus the bird, the turtle, and then the salamander and the fish, right? So huge differences. I want you to notice that the fish and the salamander, the ones all the way on the left, they're the oldest out of all these organisms. They evolved before all of these other ones did. And we can see that they're the first ones to really start looking like themselves. The rest of the organisms, however, you can see how there are massive changes occurring that make them look very different than their embryonic form, and those changes are those accrued evolutionary changes in DNA over time. So over time, as genetic mutations have arisen and been selected for, or alleles have arisen in frequency in a population, that's what you're seeing. It's changing the code, it's adding it on. It's not completely rewriting the code because you never rewrite the code, you just add on to it or modify it. So we can see those modifications, those small, slight modifications over time show this beautiful evolutionary lineage from the oldest organisms all the way to the more recently evolved. But we all start with the same code, which suggests that we all came from the same common ancestor. Okay, so we can see again, it shows common ancestry. Humans do start with gills and a tail, but we certainly don't keep them. And all organisms start with gills and a tail. They don't all keep them. We have the same developmental order. We develop the same tissues and organ structures at the same time in our development, regardless of differences in that development. So it's pretty cool to look at this and be like, wow, it's kind of humbling to look at it and be like, we all come from the same place. And here are those stages of development we can see in humans. That amazing, amazing development from the little ball of cells all the way up to what we become. It's pretty incredible. It's just code. It's just code. We're machines, you know. It really makes you think. Anyway. Okay, and then there's molecular biology. So molecular biology is where we compare the DNA and the genes between organisms. And we know that our DNA controls the traits that we develop, and it controls our proteins, how much is made and what they look like, and how they function. So our genes are pretty important. If we hold up the genes of our genomes and compare them across organisms, so compare the genome of a human to a rabbit, to a cat, to a whale, to a bird, to a bat, we can look at the differences, and those differences tell us how closely related we are. The more differences, the further we are from them, evolutionarily speaking, and the fewer differences, the more closely related we are. Okay, so the more similar your DNA is to something else, the more related you are to it. Now this slideshow gives us an example in gel electrophoresis, and this is kind of like gel electrophoresis where we are able to compare the similarities between DNA, and we do use a similar process to do this evolutionarily. But evolutionarily, it's a lot more broad. In gel electrophoresis, we're just kind of looking for the identification of an individual, so we're just comparing DNA sequences to find the same person. But in evolution, it's a bit bigger. So these represent gene sequences of the same gene between gorillas, chimps, and humans. And we can see that the only difference between the gorillas and the chimps, because if you look at the humans and the chimps are exactly alike. The only difference that the gorilla has between humans and chimps are these small one-letter differences, maybe an A here, a G there, a C there, and that's it. Otherwise, their genes are almost exactly identical. So when you compare organisms, you can compare the similarities between their DNA or between their amino acids to tell how similar and how closely related they are. So I want to show you a quick diagram to help you to better understand that. It's in this one right here. So we go down here and we see that when we compare a human gene to a human gene, there's zero difference because they're both human. But if we compare that same human gene to a rhesus monkey, there are 8 differences. To a mouse, there's 27, to a chicken, 45, and so on. And that allows us to see, okay, well, the lamprey has the most differences, so it's the least related to humans out of this list. And the rhesus monkey has the fewest, so it's the most related to humans out of this list. And that's how we can start building trees. So if you look at this tree down here, we can see this is a tree of evolutionary relationships. It's kind of like a family tree, but instead of showing the very close relationships of family members, it's showing the evolutionary relationships between lineages. So we can see that these nodes right here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6, they represent common ancestors. We might not have a name for them or know what they are, but we know they must have existed. And those common ancestors split off into the different lineages that you see here. These little lines show the development of really important features that help us to distinguish unique characteristics that evolved in those organisms. So here, feathers evolved, and that led to the evolution of ostriches and other birds. Here, amnion, which is the fluid within eggs, evolved so that these organisms could have eggs. So in mammals, we don't have eggs, but we have amniotic fluid surrounding our embryos in the womb. And then down here, all lizards and snakes and crocodiles and ostriches and hawks and other things, they all lay eggs, right? So that allowed for us to be able to have young on land rather than having to have them in the water. And then digit-bearing limbs, so anything that has toes, right? So it's everything. Everything has toes down here, but the lungfishes don't. So we can see this common ancestor, when it split off, this lineage evolved toes, and this one didn't, and this led to all that stuff, right? So it's pretty cool with the evolutionary tree. We can split these into 3 big groups, where we can split them into smaller lineages and show how related they are based off of their traits. So it's pretty neat. Okay, the final pieces of evidence that I just want to briefly talk about is disease resistance. So we can see that bacterial infections are becoming resistant to a lot of our antibiotics, and that's pretty crazy because antibiotics are basically our best defense against these diseases, so it sucks for us. But what that really means is that evolution is happening in these organisms to be able to resist antibiotics. Natural selection is selecting for the organism bacteria that can survive the antibiotic, and those are passing on those abilities to survive to their offspring. And so we're in this constant war. So that, along with our battle against viruses, are 2 beautiful examples of evolution happening in real time. And then, of course, direct observation. So we can also see things like the pepper moth changing its phenotype based off of the amount of pollution in the atmosphere. We can see it in insect populations that are becoming resistant to our herbicides and pesticides, and we can see it in the Galapagos finches as their beaks change. So there's a lot of evidence for evolution. This is just a brief overview of the different types of evolutionary evidence. Tomorrow, or excuse me, Wednesday, you guys are going to go over some great examples and explore some of this for yourself. I hope you've enjoyed this, guys. I hope you've enjoyed learning about how the tree of life all came from a common ancestor and adaptation and modification over time. I look forward to that exploration on Wednesday. Until then, stay safe, stay healthy, and I hope you guys have a great day.